Hello. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you are in. I am Daphne Bernard. I am at Howard University, located in the nation's capital, right in Washington, D.C. It is a pleasure to be here today with you with my colleague, Glenn. Today, we're going to talk a bit about how we use storytelling and assessment. I am one of the associate provosts here at the university, as well as the accreditation liaison officer.
And Glenn.
Yeah, thanks so much, Enrique. My name is Glenn Phillips. I'm a senior insights consultant at Watermark. I joined Watermark a couple of years ago after serving as the director of assessment under Dr. Bernard at Howard University. I was there for about 4 years, taking them and supporting them through an accreditation visit and setting up some assessment activities and practices at the institution. I am currently now in Austin, Texas, working with Watermark as kind of an inside special advisor to some of our products and some of our sales teams. So really excited about talking a little bit more about some of the opportunities and some of the challenges that came with understanding how storytelling and storying were actually a part of the assessment process, even when we didn't know it was.
Thank you. With that being said, Dr. Bernard, take it away. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. So I'm actually going to kick things over to Glenn to kind of start us off as we get ready to tell you a bit about assessment and storytelling at Howard University.
Yeah, thanks so much, Daphne. So this work actually first came to light in a public way when we were asked to be one of the exemplars of assessment in higher education in a book that was edited by Jane Marie Sousa, who is at Rochester, and then at Tara Rose, who is at LSU. And they asked us to talk a little bit about the work that we were doing at Howard. What they did is they went out to different accreditation agencies and said, give us some examples of people who are doing this well and some interesting things that they're doing. And luckily, Middle States was kind enough to advise them to come talk to us. So we put together a book chapter. So if you are interested, I just wanted to put that up there. That is where this document is coming from. But the work that we were doing internally is a lot more interesting. Living it than just reading about it, but we're hoping to bring some of that to light in our conversation today. One of the things that we do want to encourage as we go into our conversation today is that we are excited about making this a conversation. I see in the chat lots of people introducing themselves from all over the nation, which is really exciting. We also want to encourage you to put some information in if you have any questions, any comments. We'll be reviewing the chat as we're going through this conversation, and we want to make sure to include you in it as well. So if you have any questions, any follow-up on anything that we have to say, we're happy to engage with those as well. I am actually going to turn it over to Dr. Bernard here in a little bit. And as I worked underneath her, you'll hear me constantly flip back and forth between Daphne and Dr. Bernard. It's kind of like when you finish your dissertation and your dissertation chair says, you can just call me by my first name, but no matter how many times you try, it just doesn't sound right in the mouth. So we'll balance that out throughout our time together. But I did want to give a little bit of a cultural context and a historic context to Howard University, because understanding Howard University and understanding the mission of Howard University and what makes it special is really important to understanding why we think storytelling was an important part of our assessment process. And as someone far more familiar with Howard than I am, I'll let Daphne talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So context matters. And so when we think about the uniqueness of Howard University, we keep that in mind as we, look at what evidence we're going to provide for assessment. So Howard, we've been around for quite some time, since the 1800s. Really was established as an opportunity for a group that were previously enslaved so that they could find a way to become educated and take care of themselves and their communities. I say that because even today, Howard it stands as a special place for, again, not only one group of individuals, but globally as well. We have grown and we are continuing to grow. Back in during our last strategic plan, we had a goal of having about 12,000 students by 2024. Well, as of right now, we have almost 14,000 students. We continue to get students, we get top students, but it makes it even more pressing for us to really be intentional about providing that high quality, exceptional academic experience. So now more than ever, really taking a serious look at how we tell our story, how we tell that story of excellence and what that looks like for Howard University becomes extremely important. So we were really excited to do this chapter, and again, really excited to kind of hear your thoughts and get you to think about how you look at your mission and how you decide to tell your assessment story as well.
Yeah. One of the things that was really unique about the timing of when I joined, we were just at the eve of an accreditation visit for Middle States. We were putting together a new office of institutional effectiveness that included a director of assessment, a director of IR, as well as some support positions for both of those areas. And I share this slide with you to talk a little bit about where we were coming from. So I had just come from the University of Texas at Arlington. My associate director had come from Tennessee Tech, the director of IR from St. Joseph's, and her support from University of Nebraska, Lincoln. The reason why I share these is that these institutions, by both mission and demographic, by both funding as well as research interests, are incredibly different from Howard University. And so when we came to Howard University, there was a real opportunity for us to pause and think about how the work that we had done and how we had learned things would be applied in this new environment, in this new place, in this new world that we were all learning. And I'll be the first to admit, we didn't do that super well at first. There's a way in which, in the world of assessment, especially a self-affirmed, compliance-oriented assessment professional, I get called in, I used to say, to floss before the dentist. If you're about to go to the dentist, I'm here to help you floss and make sure that everything's good and ready to go. So when we were coming in, we really came in with the idea that we needed to fix things without taking time to see what needed to be fixed or if it needed to be fixed. We were also coming in with all of these skill sets that were working at other institutions, that were working at institutions whose mission was not like Howard at all. Now, I want to be really, really clear. Howard was not in trouble. Howard had no issues with their prior accreditation. But anytime you go in and you're doing any accreditation at any institution, you're always doing it with a certain, I feel like all assessment professionals have some low-level anxiety that they're supposed to be the ones to fix everything, whether it's broken or not. I think I get that from my mother. But as we go into these adventures, we take the tool sets that we learned and then we try to apply them in a new place. One of my colleagues, at one point we were talking about like that we were a Band-Aid for this institution, but then it was almost a false Band-Aid, like when you're a child and you just want a Band-Aid because you think having a Band-Aid looks cool. There was nothing that needed to be fixed, but in our mind, we were supporting things. And I think that that's what really started this conversation about thinking about what is the story that assessment tells? What does that process look like? And then what was our experience being self-reflective, thinking about to what degree are we actually being a fix? And to what degree might we be distracting from recognizing that a fix is unnecessary? Daphne?
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make. As Glenn noted, before we did the restructuring around 2017, we had an actually it was Office of Institutional Assessment and Effectiveness. And so assessment had been going on at Howard University, but it was going on in a different manner. And as you all know, over the past several years, assessment is like the hot button for any institution preparing for accreditation. So as Glenn mentioned, our team was really focused on getting this right, making sure that we were compliant and we have the evidence to demonstrate that compliance. But as we'll discuss, in the next few minutes, how we go about doing that really mattered. And again, as he talked about, we kind of noticed after the fact that, there may have been an even better way to do this and to really, tell the story of Howard University.
Yeah. I share this in the chapter that we wrote as well, but one of my first meetings for accreditation at Howard was with Dr. Ellie Fogarty at Middle States. And she started off by saying, "We want you to tell a story." And I paused and I heard her, and then I started doing something else because in my mind, coming from a SACS background, we don't care about stories. There is a formula. You say, "We are compliant." Once again, we are compliant. Here is some evidence showing that we are compliant. As a friendly reminder, we are compliant. And then you send that for every single narrative, and that's how you check your boxes. But now I had this person from Middle States encouraging the provost and all the deans and my direct supervisor that we just want to understand your story, tell us your story. And I approached that with incredulity. And then when we started writing narratives, it was much more written like a SACS narrative than it was a Middle States narrative, as I was starting the smaller narratives that I was helping with in standards, 3 and 5 that were dealing with assessment, because that's how we understood it. And that's how the rest of my folks understood it that I was working directly with. It was only after our process that we realized, oh, a story was actually exactly what we should have been saying the whole time, and what would have done our institution better justice had we stuck to. Now, to be clear, we had a really successful Middle States accreditation event. It was problematized by the fact that it was just the timing was poor because we happened to do our accreditation right in the middle of the height of the pandemic. But they had a lot of nice things to say about the way that we were doing things at Howard University and how we were moving forward. One of the things that we're going to chat about today is this idea of story, storying, and storytelling. Now, this is not from us. We stole this like all good assessment professionals, poets and assessment professionals. We're the greatest thieves in all the world. But Banks Wallace, in her work on nursing, does a lot of work on talking about what does story mean? Why is it important? And she's the one who breaks it up in this idea of story, storying, and storytelling. And it was one of our colleagues, Britt, that brought this to light and said this would be a really good framework to think about the way we're talking about things. And so to go directly to the source, Banks Wallace describes story as a depiction of an event or series of events that is generally, but not always, encompassed, but boundaries of time or space. And so the idea that when we're telling a story, it is not absent its context. That's why I was so happy that Daphne shared a little bit more of the context about Howard when we started, because that context matters. But it's not just the place that you're working, it's also inclusive of the time that you're working in. And even why you're doing it matters to the story. If you're telling a story to entertain or to inform, those are really different approaches to story, and they need to be considered differently. We'll briefly share, and then I'll ask Daphne to expand a little bit. But one of the important contexts that we just shared to our story when it came to working on our accreditation and our assessment that supported that accreditation was that we were doing it in the middle of a pandemic. I know a lot of institutions during the pandemic halted all of their assessment, and they were like, there's just too much going on. The world's on fire. We don't know anything that's happening right now. We don't have information. We fear things when we don't have information. We are just going to say assessment's done. Don't worry about this, worry about other things. We were kind of those terrible, wonderful people who insisted that assessment should still go on. And the reason why is because assessment was not an activity or a box that needed to be checked that we were okay not checking because it was another thing. Assessment was actually the way that we talked about how our institution worked and what our institution was doing and whether we were meeting things. The fact that things were not being met because we were in the middle of a pandemic needed to be captured in the same way that the way that things were being met while we were in the middle of a pandemic needed to be captured. And so we had a lot of our professionals who we were working with and our faculty and our department chairs, and they're like, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I have a measure, and the measure is for a course that we didn't even hold this semester. What am I supposed to do? Write that. Tell us that. I didn't even grade my students' papers. We're all on fire. I just gave them all A's just because they showed up. What am I supposed to do about that? Tell us that. That's perfectly fine as well. Give us context to the grades. To be fair, no faculty member said that they just gave everybody A's. But moving from a graded structure to a pass-fail structure happened at our institution. And so, as it did at many institutions, so how did they deal with that? How did they negotiate and navigate that? Whether it was good, bad, or ugly, all we said is write about it. And they said, what if I'm so overwhelmed, I don't even want to write anything? That's fine. Write that. Say, I'm too overwhelmed, I can't even think about this. Because in 5 years, when we look back at our story, we need the story. And the story won't exist if you didn't write it down. So when we talk about story and when Banks Wallace talks about story, it's understanding the context. It's understanding the place, the time, and the people involved.
Absolutely. I will admit I was a bit nervous with Glenn's approach because he's absolutely correct. He pretty much told the faculty as well as the staff over units, just write it. Just tell us whatever your status is, just put that in there and submit your plan. And I think it was much appreciated, quite frankly, by the university stakeholders because we were showing that flexibility and at the same time still maintaining the importance of documenting exactly what you're doing. And so kudos. And as Glenn said, when we really do look back to see how did we navigate assessment during a pandemic, guess what? We have that information. And so exactly, and you'll see that even in the chapter, whatever your story is, whatever is going on with your unit, what adjustment you had to make, maybe, there instead of 3 outcomes, there was only one you looked at or whatnot. Maybe there was a new activity that you had to introduce to accommodate more of the virtual, the remote learning. Add that, put that in there. It all becomes a part of the assessment. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But one of the things that, and I'll take this as a moment again to, if you have any questions, any comments, feel free to put them into the chat. We want to hear from you as well and a little bit of your story. And also, if you have any specific questions about anything that we're talking about, we encourage you to put that in the chat and we will be monitoring that and bringing that into the conversation as well. One of the things that Daphne and I wanted to do is not just say, here's what we did at Howard, have a great day. But we wanted to also suggest some practical steps that might be helpful for you as you're thinking about doing this kind of work at your own institution. So one of these practical steps is this idea of taking time to consider what makes your institution and this moment in which you are assessing your institution unique, and use that as you develop your story. And for us, it was a pandemic, but right after the pandemic, we also had a change in our LMS, which was important. We also changed in our SIS, which was important. We also had a new president step in, which was important. So it doesn't have to be a pandemic that denotes the time that you're working in. It could be, our director of assessment left. And now we're talking in this story of what does it look like now with new people in the office and navigating new people. And then more importantly, thinking about what makes your institution unique and specific. Howard University as an HBCU, as a uniquely federally chartered institution. Like there's a lot of things about being in DC. There's a lot of things about Howard that make it an incredibly unique institution. And so when we tell the story of Howard, which is what assessment is, it's telling the story of an institution. We have to be aware of all of those things happening at once, and those things have to come out in some way in the stories that we're telling.
One of the other things I want to note is it could also, in terms of time and what's happening, one of the key initiatives that was happening right around as we were preparing for our accreditation was prioritization. So program review. Well, guess what? Because now some financial decisions were being evaluated both based on a review of the program, that actually influenced how some programs assessed how their students were doing, how operationally efficient they were. So even if it's a new strategic plan that's about to be launched, or if there's another university initiative, use that or consider that as you do reflect on what is it do I want to really say about my institution, about my program, so that as you develop your outcomes, then those things can kind of be highlighted.
Great point. I do see a comment in the chat or a question, and no question is off topic. All questions eventually flow to assessment. So you can ask about cinnamon toast. It doesn't matter. It will eventually come back to assessment. But there was a question about when we switched to pass-fail during the pandemic, did that discourage higher level thinkers from stretching their thinking? I'll answer this and then I'll depend on Daphne to follow up. I would say that one, it was done for a very short period of time in response to the pandemic. And so it wasn't carried on as a practice for years and years afterwards. Secondly, it was part of an effort to understand the unique situation of our faculty members as well as the unique situation of our students. Working at Howard, we were able to see how the pandemic disproportionately affected communities of color. And so I think that there were a lot of folks who are offering grace in all circumstances, and that also extended to our students, offering grace to instructors and recognizing this was a momentary restructuring to help their community and their colleagues and their student community in negotiating this. So I think that you're absolutely right. There would have been dangers in that had it been extended to an institutional practice that was year over year, but it was more momentary.
Excellent, excellent question. Talk about the uniqueness of Howard and what was happening around the pandemic. One of the things that quickly stood out was our students were struggling. We know that our faculty, even administrators, we were all in flux trying to figure this out. But our students, what we learned when we just listened and observed our students, there were some students that were international students, and as well as some domestic students who really were struggling for another place to even study and engage in their classwork. Some of them had family situations with the pandemic. Some of them were being asked to turn their cameras on during classes, and they just did not feel comfortable or in a position to do that. And some of them, because of the pandemic, they just were having trouble focusing on the schoolwork. And so that pass-fail approach is something that several institutions took on, including Howard. And I think one reason that's important is because when you are being flexible based on the circumstance of your student population, that will impact how you assess. And so, yeah, it was a temporary thing. But I think more than anything, it was an acknowledgement that this is tough. It's a tough time for all of us. And we were still able to have meaningful assessment and academic delivery occurring.
Yeah. And I see this second response as well, that because of the advances made in racial healing or racial advancement during the pandemic, some pretend these things didn't happen and go back to the previous status quo. I will say Howard was a unique institution that these kind of growth opportunities were met with a lot of student invigoration and student support and faculty support and administrative support in a way that it actually created an opportunity for, I think, the administrators to stand up for Howard and its students in a really unique way that as a staff member hanging out there was really kind of beautiful to see, but certainly still more work to be done on all of those fronts. I want to talk a little bit about assessment and storing. I do see
Glenn,
yep.
Glenn, real quick, I put a a PDF file on the chat of your standards. But you don't, do you mind answering just a quick question? On standard 3, which is for design delivery of the student learning experience,
Mhm.
what was the most difficult part as you are talking about focusing on student learning? How did you capture the evidence for student learning?
And standard 3, and Daphne, keep me honest because I've been away from the table for a bit, but this is more focused on including general education assessment and things like that, or is this I think that this is more about institutional learning outcomes, and then standard 5 is more about the general assessment process. I think that's correct, but I'll actually answer that in a little bit, and then I'll get back to it. So it's on our docket. Don't let me forget. We're going to talk about student essays in just a moment. Um, the second area that Banks-Wallace suggests is this idea of assessment is storying. So story is this actual, like, what are the parts of this? Storying is the actual act of putting those parts together and finding where those elements previously viewed as disconnected and independent are being pulled into focus as parts of this unified collage. One of the challenges with our approach, and my approach, I will admit, my approach to our accreditation work when I was at Howard was Sachs sees this as little drawers. Think of like a little advent calendar. You open up this one, you close it. You open up this one, you close it. They're all very separate. Whereas middle states, and then by virtue of that, Howard, it really is, how do all of these things blend together? How do all of these things come together to create this larger story? So if we're talking about student support services, and we're talking about finance, and we're talking about academic programs, instead of just checking each one of those boxes individually, what if we pushed all of that together and said, how are we funding the student services that are making sure our students are in their courses and learning? Let's talk about all of it together. Let's talk about all of it together. And that's when Banks-Wallace talks about storying. It really is about creating a collage and bringing all of this together. I'll use a quick example of one of the ways that we did that. Our our platform, like many platforms, or our process was, give us measures, talk about your measures, talk about whether you met them, give us an action item or some analysis, and then we do that 3 or 4 measures for each academic program. We'll do that once a year. It's a very standard program because, again, we're bringing it from wherever we came from and setting it up. And it wasn't completely unlike what was going on at Howard. But one of the things that was happening at Howard before I showed up is that people were submitting basically just their stories, their mini stories of assessment, and then they would pull from that for accreditation reports and things like that. And so I wanted to honor that and honor this tradition of storytelling by, after we went through middle states, I actually went to our faculty members and some department chairs and I said, we're going to do assessment differently right now. You still have to fill out the form because I'm a Virgo and I like forms and I want them to be completed. But I'm really curious about telling me something that you're really proud of that changed in your office or in your department. And then tell me why you made that change. And then tell me what happened. That's it. Tell me what happened. You're excited about it. Make me excited about it. And then I would write that up as a 1-pager. And that became data as well. Instead of just here's a form that we filled out, it was about engaging. I'm going to let Daphne talk a little bit more about engaging with folks as I read through some more of the comments to respond.
Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite parts about how Glenn went about the assessment and the entire approach of the team. And honestly, to this day, sometimes we have to do that. Sometimes with faculty, when you tell them, look, it's time for you to submit your assessment plan. We need you to submit outcomes and measures and do it by October the 1st. For some faculty, that's a bit of a zone that they're uncomfortable with. Well, exactly what do you mean by the learning outcomes? Are those objectives? Well, are those the same as program outcomes? And then so sometimes confusion in terms of just the nomenclature, the assessment nomenclature becomes a barrier. Sometimes it's time. I just don't have time to sit down and do this plan and write it up. And so what Glenn used to do, he's exactly right. He would go and he would have conversations. And to this day, when we have some units that may be a bit delayed or struggling with completing their assessment, we have conversations and say, tell us a story. Tell us something unique that you did with the curriculum. I like to always focus on, tell me about one curriculum improvement that you made last year. Okay, what was that based on? How did you know you needed to do that? Give me some context behind that. What other factors influence this? Did you have a new department chair in place? Did you lose faculty? Did you have an influx of students that may not have been as academically prepared? But let's have the conversation. And so absolutely, for institutions where we have faculty that may not be so likely to fill out a template or just engage in our platform for their assessment, they are usually very comfortable with sitting there and telling you the story of the success for their students. One thing, Glenn, I don't know if you're going to mention this a little bit in more detail, but using an actual assessment platform is extremely helpful in assessment. And how does that relate so beautifully with storytelling? Well, think of it this way. When you put a story together, it doesn't necessarily just all come out at once. You know, there's a kind of like an outline, and then as you look at it again, well, I left this part out. Well, actually, let me clarify this area. Well, with an actual assessment tool, a platform to do this, faculty can actually go in and look at what they've selected for their assessment. They can add to, they can change. So the richness of the assessment was allowed to happen largely, again, because we now had a platform to do that. So those are the two things that I think are really important takeaways. Having conversations and having units just tell their story about the student success, and then having a platform, a tool, so that you're, again, in the chapter, it says faculty aren't just submitting, they're actually engaging and building and creating the story of the student success.
And Daphne, I just wanted to highlight a question in the chat because I think it tags really nicely to what you're talking about as far as the use of technology to support this. So there's the question, glad to hear the encouragement to use storytelling framework came from an accreditator. I wanted to ask if you could say more about the transition to the new LMS and SIS and how that helped or perhaps added new barriers with your storying in terms of data collection and management.
Yeah, great question. So I would say one of the challenges in switching the LMS, we went from Blackboard to Canvas, largely happened when programs needed their course evaluation data. And during the transition, there were some technical glitches where we had some hiccups with programs actually, you know, the instructor being aligned. I think it's probably off of me. There we go. All right, thank you. So in terms of the switching of the LMS, there was an impact on programs being able to use course evaluation data, not a lot, but just a few, enough for it to really be a concern. We had that challenge in the switch. And in terms of the student information system, the good thing is it was fully rolled out, honestly, in fall of this year. We had some courses, some programs that were testing it, but we didn't have a full rollout to Bison Hub by Workday until fall of 2024. And so we haven't really felt much impact of that switching SIS for the assessment process. And so, you know, it's ultimately we'll have greater efficiencies, but during that initial switch in the LMS system, it did pose somewhat of a challenge.
Yeah, and I will give credit to Daphne and in answering one of these questions. But Daphne created an office of IR, and I've worked in places where assessment lives literally on separate sides of the campus from where IR lives, and ne'er the twain shall meet, and they are not allowed to have coffee together. Please keep them at a distance. Daphne created an office where we were right beside each other. We actually, my counterpart in IR. We started on the very same day in the exact same orientation, and we worked very, very closely together. In the chat, there's a lot of conversation about qualitative data, storying, and then numbers. You have demands of numbers. People have demands of numbers at the state level. They have demands of numbers at discipline level accreditors. They have demands and numbers from regional accreditors or institutional accreditors for annual reports. And they also have demands for numbers from systems if they're a part of a board, things like that. One of the things that we were able to do is that because we work so closely together, whenever I needed more numbers, they were always there and available for me, and they knew what my needs are, and I made that really clear early on. I do want to clarify that the work that we were doing in assessment was not in place of any kind of data or key performance indicators or metrics that people were doing. What we were asking them to do is literally, I would go to, I'll use financial aid because everyone loves to pick on financial aid. I would say, give me an assessment plan. And they say, we don't do assessment plans. And I say, do you collect any data whatsoever? They said, of course we do. We're financial aid. We have all the data in the world. And I said, do you report that data to anyone? Of course we do. We have monthly KPIs that we perform and we give in these slide decks. And I said, that's great. Just give me a slide deck. And then they would give me a slide deck and I would populate everything into the assessment plan and I'd give it back to them and say, your assessment plan is done. I did it for you. All that I need you to do is make this mean something. What do you want to do? Now that you have this data and you know that you met or didn't meet this threshold that you set in your own slide deck, tell me what that means. Oh, that's easy. We're going to do this, this, and this. It's an easy fix. Great. Your assessment plan is done. And so part of it was meeting them where they are, where they were, thinking about numbers. And I think the numbers can become storying when it is put in the context and collaged, as Banks Wallace suggests, with other things that are happening on campus, and it doesn't exist as a number. And I would actually say it's our responsibility as IE people, as assessment people, as IR people, and as accreditation people to push back as gently as we can on people who would suggest that only the number outside of its context matters.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I saw that over in the chat. And here's the good news. It does not have to be a either or. You can do both. You can have a wonderful report of all the outcomes, measures, the actions as a result of them, the results. You can have a nice report from all of your units, but guess what? You can also have case studies, stories that give even more rich context to what's happened within student learning across campus. And so, you know, and I will say this, Glenn, I don't know if the audience knows, Glenn has a math degree. So it doesn't hurt when you have someone in assessment who knows numbers and really appreciates numbers, but also has that qualitative side as well, and appreciation for the context. But you can absolutely do both. And that gives you an even more well-rounded picture of how you really are going about evaluating student learning for your program and across your institution.
I had no idea that undergraduate in math and a master's in creative writing actually had a career trajectory. It was assessment and accreditation. We did want to give one practical step as you're thinking about storying. And this is more of just a reflective moment. If you think of assessment as more of a communal dinner, that people are coming together to eat together and talk together and communicate together, and think of it more like that than a fast food restaurant that's transactional where I'm going to fill out a form. Am I done? Did I get what I needed to go? And then leave. If you were going to make that change, what changes would you make in your process? Now, I do want to be really respectful of resources because I remember when I was an early assessment professional, I was working for a very large 40,000 student PWI. And I would go to these conferences and they would talk about assessment. They're like, how do you do assessment? And they were like, well, we get together every Friday over tea and we talk about our student learning outcomes and whether we've met them. And we come together and make decisions as a community about how to best serve our students. And I'm thinking, I've called the poli-sci department chair 93 times and he refuses to take my call. How am I going to have tea with anyone, much less the entire community? And then I realized this other school is a private faith-based institution with 43 faculty members. And it's a very different kind of approach to assessment, understanding the context of the institution. So I also want you to think about what can you do understanding your own resources and understanding your own institution. This is why, if you've ever heard me talk before, I hate the term best practices. It's my least favorite term because it assumes that everyone is resourced and prepared the exact same way and that there is a competitive best. So instead, I use good practices. And so think about what are the good practices that you could do on your own campus to think of it more as a communal dinner and less of a fast food restaurant. In the interest of time, we're going to jump into the next one really quickly because we've talked about what makes a story. We've talked about the process of storying, which is building this story by pulling things together. And I haven't forgotten about you, Enrique. Now we're going to talk about assessment as storytelling. I love this quote from Banks Wallace. During formal storytelling sessions, many cultures have specific rituals to indicate the shift from real time to story time and back again. These rituals remind story takers, those who receive and translate the stories, that stories take place in a realm in which the usual rules are suspended and anything is possible. It's important to think of storytelling as a way of projecting, but also inviting the story takers in so that they are understanding and learning what's going on. I think one of the reasons we were so successful in our Middle States accreditation was that we had several committees of faculty members who gave firsthand accounts of what their experience as part of the assessment and accreditation process was. And our reviewers were really just kind of entranced by learning about what it felt like to be part of it. And so it wasn't just, here's a report. They were invited into the creation of the report, the thought of the report, the review of the report, the frustrations, the opportunities, the excitement of it all. And they became, for that moment, part of the university, suspending the understanding that they were not actually part of the university. In that moment, they became part of the story.
I would say they became a huge part of the story. Everything from being involved in the committees to, as Glenn mentioned, that would develop the rubrics and review what the timeline would look like, to also being the cheerleaders that were within their units that are reminding the faculty of, okay, these are the deadlines. Okay, if you have questions about using the system, I'm here to assist you with. And one thing, Glenn, I'm hoping that you'll just mention, even if it's briefly, if you can mention the essay, the opportunity for the students to even become a part of being the storyteller.
Yeah, I'll jump right to it. There is, so Enrique, to answer your question, the majority of folks who are answering any questions about institutional learning outcomes or general education at their institutions are doing very traditional processes, right? I'm going to take 50 student artifacts. I'm going to use a cadre of faculty members to evaluate them based on a rubric, and we're going to talk about student success over these courses, over these artifacts. We did that. We also identified some specific courses that were linked to some of our unique institutional learning outcomes. We have, Middle States has 6 that they recommend everybody do. And then we added a 7th one, which was understanding the impact of the African diaspora, because Howard is a unique institution. And so we would go to certain courses that was a primary academic goal. And then we would take whatever artifact already graded, and it would write up papers on that. And so those were some of the ways that we engaged in providing data for Middle States based on our institutional learning, is traditional juried assessment, as well as finding signature assignments that were already being done in courses, pulling that information and doing reports on it. The third way, which I was really excited about and was a lot of fun, is we recognize that our students learned these institutional learning outcomes in a variety of ways, sometimes in ways that we didn't even anticipate. And so we created an essay contest where we gave, I think, $50 gift cards to the winner or something like that. But it was all we said is, here are Howard's institutional learning outcomes. Tell us where you learned this. That's it. Just tell us where you learned this. We had people talk about how they learned it in the classroom. Had people talk about how they learned it in student affairs, in athletics, outside working in the community, how they learned it at their on-campus job, all of these different things where we were able to give these little sound bites of students telling their stories. And I think it's important to talk about that in this moment, because that's when we became the story takers. And we had to recognize and reconcile our positionality as the receiver of what is really truly kind of a remarkable and special thing, which is the student experience, especially when given to you by a student. There's a way in which we often look at assessment reports and we say, 83% of students met this threshold, so we're going to count this good, and then we're going to move on. Forgetting that 83% is each a student experience, someone who did something and thought about something and struggled over a test question and were really excited that they got it right, or were really demoralized when they got it wrong and had to find a resource and pick themselves back up and engage in it in a new way. And so we wanted to reach out to the student and not assume we knew their story, but invite them to be the authors of their own stories as they co-created institutional knowledge alongside us. And it's also just fun to read essays. The practical step that we would offer with this is to ask yourself who your story takers are. Said another way, when you're gathering assessment data, IE data, things like that, even IR data, who are you gathering it for? Who is it for? Why do you exist on your campus? I feel like assessment and accreditation people are like second only to philosophy majors and faculty members about having existential crises on campus. Why am I even here? Why am I even gathering all of this data? Is it only for one event every 8 years, or is there more to it? And I think it's in that process that you realize there is more to it. And you are the carrier of knowledge of your institution in specific ways, and providing additional information to share that through the storytelling process, identifying different story takers and adjusting the story appropriately to meet them. I see a question here about the criteria and how long the essay has to be. We wanted people to jump in easy. We said no more than 250 words. I want them to jump in. If it's a paragraph, it can be a paragraph. That's perfectly fine. And you can enter as many times as you want. We like to lower the bar of entry into the adventure of storytelling, because sometimes if it's like if you're applying for a conference and they're like, you need to have a 93-page report written before you can even apply for this conference, I'm not interested. You want an abstract? I'll apply to every single one of them. And that's where the really fun, innovative, exciting new ideas come from, because they didn't have time to germinate all the time into a 93-page report.
I was just going to quickly add, think about it too. Students are constantly asked to do things like take course evaluations. Well, by having this essay opportunity, it actually gave them an opportunity where, again, with them being the storyteller, they felt more engaged. And so they saw assessment, the bigger picture of it, and not just, filling out this course evaluation because somebody said to do it. So the takeaway is, by having more creative ways to involve your stakeholders in some of the assessment processes, you can actually make progress by getting even more engagement.
Mm-hmm. And one of the suggestions that I would make is, even as a first step in this kind of journey, is if instead of using the word assessment, you use story, what would that do? If instead of saying, hey, did you turn in your assessment report? say, hey, did you share your story about student learning with us yet? Are you done with your story on how advising did this year? Are you done with that story? It changes the frame of how people are approaching it, because instead of filling out a form, they are sharing something and inviting you into something that matters to them. And that changes the game quite significantly. And then the details of what constitutes story and things like that can differ from institution to institution. There is a rich history of storytelling within communities of color, and that's why storying and storytelling made a lot of sense at Howard, and it was not an easily learned process. It was done often when I was trying to push a different agenda, or my colleagues were pushing a different agenda, and people would say, wait, why aren't we doing it this way? Or why are you making us do it this way? And when the answer is just because that's the way we did it at the last school, or that's the way I learned how to do it, that's not enough. And so it creates an opportunity to dig a little deeper and think a little bit more, so that you can create new opportunities for people to be authentically involved in the story making and the story taking and the storytelling of your institution. I did want to give credit where credit is due. So if someone's interested in checking out Banks Wallace's work, this is the article that we really focused on. And you're free to find Daphne and I on LinkedIn or any of the other places you can find us, and we're happy to share this citation with you. But some exciting opportunities to think about the way that story exists in the academy already, and then applying it to this world of assessment, which is often bereft of story when it's actually foundational to it. It looks like we've got about 5 minutes or so before we'll peel off. And there's a question about whether or not this is digitally available. We were able to find it through the library resources at Howard. And so if you have any, and the book chapter itself, I don't know if that's digitally available, but golly gee, I can sure find out.